She was screaming into her phone before the police lights even appeared, pointing at me like I was a criminal caught on camera. I remember the exact words because they still echo in my head: "He's following me, he won't leave me alone, and he's standing in my driveway." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just another uncomfortable neighbor interaction, this was a 911 call designed to destroy my night, my reputation, and possibly my freedom. 10 minutes earlier, none of this existed. I had pulled into my own driveway after a long shift, tired, hungry, and looking forward to silence. The neighborhood was quiet in that suspicious way, the kind where curtains twitch and people pretend not to stare. I stepped out of my car, keys in hand, when a woman I'd never spoken to stormed across the sidewalk, phone already raised like a weapon. Her eyes were wide, her voice sharp, and her confidence absolute. She demanded to know why I was circling her house. I calmly told her I lived here, gesturing toward my front door. That answer didn't satisfy her. Instead, it seemed to energize her. She backed away, thumb flying over her screen, and announced she was calling the police because she felt threatened. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply stood there, leaning against my car, watching her performance unfold. When the dispatcher answered, the woman turned slightly so I could hear every word. She described me as suspicious, aggressive, and dangerous. She said I refused to leave. She said she feared for her life. With each sentence, the story grew more dramatic, more detached from reality. I could feel neighbors listening, absorbing her version as fact. Then the dispatcher asked a question that changed everything: "Sir, can you identify yourself?" The woman smirked, certain she had already won. I took a slow breath, reached into my wallet, and gave the dispatcher my badge number. There was a pause. A long one. The kind of silence that tells you something just broke. Behind her, a small crowd formed, drawn by flashing phones and whispered judgments. Someone murmured about the HOA rules, another nodded like this fit a pattern they already believed. I stayed still, hands visible, heart steady, because training teaches patience before truth. The dispatcher's silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, and I imagined the database updating, flags appearing, protocols activating. Every second peeled away her certainty, replacing it with confusion she tried to mask with louder accusations. Street lights flickered overhead as sirens approached, signaling consequences she never considered, and neighbors slowly realized the story was unraveling fast. And that's when I knew this call wasn't going the way she expected. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the houses, and with every second the woman's confidence shifted from loud certainty to sharp anxiety. She kept talking to the dispatcher, filling the air with accusations, repeating that I was dangerous, that I refused to leave, that something about me didn't feel right. I stayed exactly where I was, hands visible, posture relaxed, because I knew movement would only feed the story she was building. The neighbors had fully gathered now, drawn by flashing lights and the promise of spectacle, whispering theories before a single officer arrived. 2 patrol cars pulled up almost simultaneously, lights washing the street in red and blue. The woman rushed toward them, phone still pressed to her ear, narrating her version of events as if she were the victim in a crime documentary. One officer raised a hand, calmly telling her to step back. Another officer looked at me, then at my driveway, then back at her, already sensing something wasn't adding up. Experience teaches you when a scene feels staged, and this one reeked of it. The dispatcher finally spoke again, her tone noticeably different. She asked the woman to stay where she was and then asked me, very carefully, to repeat my badge number. I did. Slowly. Clearly. The woman stopped pacing. Her head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing, confusion cutting through the anger. She tried to interrupt, but the dispatcher didn't acknowledge her this time. That silence spoke louder than any accusation she had made. One officer approached me, professional but cautious, asking for identification. I handed it over without a word. He glanced down, then back up at me, his expression shifting just slightly. Not shock, not fear, but recognition. The kind that comes when the puzzle pieces suddenly lock together. Behind him, the second officer was listening to his radio, posture stiffening as information came through. The woman sensed the change before anyone explained it. Her voice rose again, louder, sharper, insisting this was a mistake, that I was lying, that people like me always had excuses. She invoked HOA rules, trespassing laws, vague threats about lawsuits and connections. Each word dug her deeper, though she couldn't see it yet. The neighbors fell quieter, curiosity replacing certainty as the energy of the scene flipped. The officer handed my ID back and spoke into his radio, confirming details. I watched the woman's face as understanding slowly crept in, not all at once, but in painful increments. The story she controlled minutes ago was slipping away from her grasp. And that was just the beginning of her realization. The officer cleared his throat and stepped slightly in front of me, not as a shield, but as a signal. The tone of the scene had changed, and everyone felt it. He asked the woman to lower her phone and end the call. She hesitated, glancing between him and me, then laughed nervously and said the dispatcher was still on the line because she didn't feel safe yet. That choice would later matter more than she knew. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone again, calm but firm, instructing her to follow the officer's directions. That alone rattled her. She had expected validation, sympathy, immediate agreement. Instead, she was being managed. The officer asked her to explain, step by step, why she believed I was stalking her. As she spoke, the gaps in her story became obvious. Times didn't match. Locations shifted. Her certainty cracked under simple questions. While she talked, another patrol car arrived, followed by a supervisor. He didn't rush in. He stood back, observing, listening, watching body language. When his eyes landed on me, there was no suspicion there, only assessment. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned to the officers. Radios chirped softly, feeding information none of the neighbors could hear. The woman noticed that nod. Her voice faltered for the first time. She tried to recover by escalating, claiming the HOA had warned her about people like me, insisting she was protecting the neighborhood. That phrase landed badly. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One woman folded her arms. Another looked down, suddenly uninterested in recording. The supervisor approached me and spoke quietly, asking where I worked. I answered just as quietly. His eyebrows lifted, just a fraction, and he gave a short, respectful nod. No announcement. No reveal. Just confirmation. He turned back to the officers and said enough for them to hear, but not the crowd. That was all it took. The officer nearest the woman changed his stance. His questions stopped being about me and started being about her. Why did she call 911 instead of the non-emergency line? Why did she claim immediate danger when I never approached her? Why did she continue the call after being instructed to stand down? Each question landed like a weight. Her face flushed. She stammered, looking around for support that wasn't there anymore. The narrative had fully collapsed. The neighbors weren't nodding now. They were watching, silent, as consequences took shape. The dispatcher remained on the line, documenting everything. I stood there, saying nothing, because the truth no longer needed my voice. The supervisor finally spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, not to announce who I was, but to reset control of the scene. He explained that the call was being reviewed in real time and that false emergency reports carried serious consequences. The woman interrupted, insisting she was just scared, just cautious, just doing what the HOA encouraged. Her words tumbled over each other, losing power with every repetition. One officer asked me to remain by my car while they sorted things out. I nodded and stayed put, watching as the focus fully shifted. The dispatcher requested the woman's full name, date of birth, and address. That request alone drained the color from her face. She asked why it was necessary. The dispatcher replied evenly that it was standard procedure when a caller might have misused emergency services. The neighbors leaned in, no longer entertained, now uncomfortable witnesses. Someone whispered that this felt serious. Another quietly slipped back inside their house. Phones lowered. The woman's confidence collapsed into defensive laughter, then into silence as she realized the call had gone very wrong. The supervisor asked her if she understood what constituted stalking under the law. She answered vaguely. He followed up by explaining the legal definition, point by point, carefully, clearly. Each detail contradicted her claims. Distance. Repeated contact. Intent. None of it fit. He then asked if she wished to amend her statement. She shook her head, trapped by her own words. The dispatcher confirmed the badge number again, and this time addressed me directly, thanking me for my patience. That small acknowledgement landed hard. The woman stared at me, finally seeing me not as a target, but as a mistake she could not undo. Her voice broke as she tried one last time to blame misunderstanding, fear, neighborhood standards. The officer informed her that the call would be forwarded for review and that she was no longer free to leave until that process was complete. She asked if she was being arrested. He said no, not yet, but she was being documented. That word echoed. Documented. I felt a familiar calm settle in. This wasn't about revenge or authority. It was about accountability. The street was quiet again, sirens off, attention fading, but the consequences were only beginning to form. I could feel eyes on me still, measuring, rethinking earlier judgments, recalibrating loyalties. The driveway lights hummed softly, insects buzzing, the night returning to normal. I knew reports would be written, audio preserved, timelines compared. Training teaches patience during aftermaths. I waited, breathing slow, grounded, aware that truth, once recorded, travels farther than any accusation ever could. Silence settled completely, and with it came certainty that accountability had begun, irreversible and instructive for everyone watching that night onward. By the time the officers finished gathering statements, the street felt different, like the aftermath of a storm that exposed things people pretended weren't there. The woman stood near the curb, arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting between officers as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. The supervisor explained, calmly and without drama, that misuse of 911 was taken seriously, especially when it involved false claims that could endanger lives. She nodded quickly, saying she understood, though it was clear she hadn't grasped the weight of it yet. One officer asked if she had any evidence to support her accusations. She hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward me, repeating that I made her uncomfortable. The officer acknowledged her feelings but reminded her that discomfort was not a crime. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. Her shoulders slumped as the reality settled in. This wasn't a neighborhood argument anymore, it was an official record. The dispatcher informed the officers that the call audio was saved and would be reviewed by a supervisor at the communications center. Hearing that, the woman's voice cracked. She asked if the recording could be deleted. The answer was a simple no. Procedures existed for a reason. The neighbors who remained exchanged uneasy looks, realizing how close gossip and fear had come to becoming something permanent. The supervisor turned to me and asked if I wished to make a statement. I declined, choosing instead to let the documentation speak for itself. He respected that choice, noting it in his pad. Sometimes restraint carries more authority than explanation. I could see a few neighbors studying me differently now, reassessing assumptions they hadn't realized they were making. The officers explained next steps to the woman, a report number, possible follow-up, and a warning that future misuse could lead to charges. She tried to apologize, but it came out tangled, mixed with justifications and blame. The apology didn't land. It wasn't meant for me anyway, it was meant to lessen consequences. As the patrol cars prepared to leave, the supervisor reminded everyone that emergency services were not tools for personal disputes. The crowd thinned, conversations hushed. I stood alone again in my driveway, the night settling back into place, knowing the story wasn't over yet. Accountability rarely ends where the lights turn off. I watched the last cruiser disappear, feeling the quiet weight of what had happened sink in. Tomorrow would bring calls, reports, and questions, but tonight offered clarity. Truth had stood still while noise burned itself out. In that stillness, lessons lingered for everyone involved, including me, about patience, power, and the responsibility that follows both. Those moments change neighborhoods, reshape trust, and remind us that accountability begins with choosing restraint over reaction when pressure demands the opposite. The next morning arrived with a different kind of noise, not sirens but notifications. My phone buzzed before sunrise, a quiet reminder that nothing involving a recorded 911 call ever truly ends at the curb. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the street wake up as if nothing had happened. Lawns were watered. Cars left for work. Normality has a way of pretending it wasn't interrupted. By mid-morning, the first call came in. Then another. Internal reviews move quickly when a dispatcher flags a call as potentially malicious. I answered questions calmly, repeating facts already preserved on audio and body cam. The clarity was comforting. When truth is documented, it doesn't need embellishment. It simply waits to be played back. Later that afternoon, I learned the HOA board had convened an emergency meeting. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, especially when power dynamics are threatened. The woman had been vocal for months, pushing rules, filing complaints, escalating small disputes into formal warnings. Last night had shifted that pattern. When authority misfires publicly, people notice. A neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door with an awkward smile and a half-formed apology. He said he hadn't realized how things had sounded until the police arrived. I thanked him for coming by. Accountability often starts with discomfort, and discomfort needs space to breathe. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Silence, I've learned, can be louder than confrontation. In the afternoon, a supervisor from communications called to inform me the dispatcher had handled the situation by the book. Her pause, the one everyone noticed, wasn't confusion. It was verification. Protocol before reaction. That detail mattered. It reframed the story from hesitation to professionalism. I made a note to pass that along to her chain of command. Good work deserves recognition. By evening, the HOA posted a vague notice about misuse of emergency services and community conduct. Names weren't mentioned, but meaning was clear. Power relies on perception, and perception had shifted. The woman stayed inside. Her curtains remained closed. Consequences don't always announce themselves, sometimes they settle quietly and refuse to leave. As night returned, I sat on the same driveway where it began, listening to cicadas, reflecting on restraint. Authority isn't about winning arguments, it's about letting systems work without interference. The truth had moved from accusation to record, from noise to evidence. Tomorrow would bring formal outcomes, but tonight confirmed something simpler: patience, when backed by documentation, outlasts performance every time. 2 days later, the outcome stopped being theoretical and became official. I received a brief email confirming that the 911 call had been classified as a false report with aggravating factors. Language like that is deliberately dry, stripped of emotion, but I understood its weight. It meant the system had finished reviewing and reached the same conclusion anyone listening objectively would. The truth had passed through every filter and remained unchanged. That afternoon, the HOA meeting notes circulated. They were careful, almost painfully neutral, but the shift was obvious. New language appeared about de-escalation, proper reporting channels, and personal responsibility. One line stood out, referencing recent events and the need to rebuild trust with local authorities. Power structures don't apologize directly, they rewrite rules instead. This was their version of acknowledgement. A neighbor stopped me while I was checking my mail. She admitted she'd assumed the worst that night because of how confident the accusation sounded. Confidence is persuasive, especially when paired with fear. We talked longer than expected, about assumptions, about how quickly stories harden into beliefs. She thanked me for staying calm. I told her calm wasn't the point, accountability was. The woman finally emerged that evening, walking quickly to her car, eyes fixed forward. No confrontation. No apology. Just avoidance. That, too, was an outcome. Consequences don't always look like punishment, sometimes they look like isolation, the slow realization that authority isn't loudness, it's credibility. She drove away, and for the first time, the street felt genuinely quiet. Later, a junior officer I'd trained years ago called. He'd been on a different shift that night but heard about the call afterward. He thanked me for modeling restraint, said it mattered to see systems trusted rather than overridden. That call meant more to me than any formal note. Influence travels sideways, not just down. As the week closed, the incident faded from conversation but not from memory. It became a reference point, a quiet lesson passed in fragments: don't weaponize emergency services, don't assume authority, don't confuse fear with fact. Stories like this don't end with sirens, they end with changed behavior. I parked in my driveway that night and stood there for a moment, looking around. Same houses. Same street. Different understanding. Truth doesn't need volume. It only needs time, patience, and the courage to let systems do what they were built to do. By the end of the week, the incident had taken on a second life, one I hadn't expected but recognized immediately. Someone had shared a version of the story online, stripped of names but heavy with speculation. Comments filled in gaps with assumptions, some accurate, others wildly off. That's how these things spread now, not through official channels, but through retellings that reflect people's fears more than facts. I didn't engage. Silence remains the most reliable form of accuracy. Inside official channels, the process moved quietly and deliberately. I was notified that the woman had been formally warned and required to attend a misuse of emergency services education session. It wasn't dramatic, but it was meaningful. Education prevents repetition. Punishment alone rarely does. The system wasn't interested in spectacle, it was interested in correction. The dispatcher reached out through her supervisor to thank me for remaining calm during the call. She admitted that when I gave the badge number, the pause everyone noticed was the moment she realized how easily situations like this could spiral if handled carelessly. Her professionalism prevented escalation. I made sure her actions were commended in writing. Accountability should always include recognition, not just consequences. The HOA board followed up with a revised protocol, outlining when residents should use emergency services and when disputes should remain civil. It was subtle, but effective. Meetings grew shorter. Complaints dropped. People became cautious in a way that suggested learning, not fear. Sometimes one incident recalibrates an entire community. I noticed changes in small interactions. Neighbors waved more. Conversations became less guarded. The unspoken tension that had hovered over the street for months lifted. Power thrives in silence, but so does trust, and this time trust won. The woman remained distant, but her influence faded. Authority, once questioned, rarely recovers quickly. One evening, I sat outside as the sun dipped below the rooftops, thinking about how close things had come to going wrong. A louder reaction, a defensive move, a rushed assumption by any one person could have rewritten the outcome entirely. Systems only work when people allow them to. This story wasn't about identity or status. It was about restraint meeting documentation, patience meeting process. It was about how quickly fear can turn into accusation, and how slowly truth reasserts itself, but how firmly it does when given space. The driveway looked the same, but I understood now how much weight a single call can carry, and how careful we all must be with the power of our words. A few weeks later, the street had fully returned to routine, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. People still parked in the same spots, followed the same schedules, complained about the same small inconveniences, yet the certainty with which authority had once been thrown around was gone. What replaced it wasn't fear of consequences, but awareness. Awareness that words matter, calls are recorded, and truth doesn't bend just because someone speaks louder. I never heard directly what the woman thought about everything afterward. I didn't need to. Her absence from HOA meetings, her silence in neighborhood discussions, and the careful distance people kept from her told the story clearly enough. Influence built on intimidation collapses the moment accountability enters the room. Once that happens, it never fully recovers. One afternoon, I ran into the supervisor who had responded that night. We exchanged a few words, nothing formal. He mentioned the call had become a quiet training example, a reminder of why verification comes before reaction and why dispatchers are taught to pause instead of panic. That mattered to me more than any apology ever could. If the incident prevented even one future escalation, it had served a purpose beyond my driveway. I thought often about how easily the outcome could have gone another way. A different tone. A rushed decision. An officer less experienced. A dispatcher who hadn't paused. Systems are strong, but only when people respect them. That night worked because restraint met procedure at exactly the right moment. That balance is fragile, and it deserves protection. The neighborhood didn't need to know who I was or what I did. In fact, it was better that they didn't. The lesson wasn't about status, it was about process. About not using emergency services as leverage. About understanding that fear doesn't override facts, and assumptions don't replace evidence. Now, when I pull into my driveway, I still pause for a second before turning off the engine. Not out of caution, but reflection. Power isn't proven by how quickly you can call for help. It's proven by how responsibly you choose to use it, and when you choose not to. That night began with an accusation meant to control a narrative. It ended with a lesson recorded, reviewed, and quietly absorbed by everyone involved. No shouting. No dramatic reveal. Just truth, preserved in audio, body cam, and paperwork, doing what it always does when given time. And if there's one thing that moment reinforced for me, it's this: when systems are trusted, and patience is practiced, truth doesn't need defending. It speaks clearly, eventually, and it always outlasts fear.